All right, welcome back, everyone. I know it has been a while since I have uploaded a video, but I want to preface this by saying that this is not a debate for or against trans and non-binary people. This is something I found of somebody that made an article about trans and non-binaries that took place, or that they say have happened or lay claims to, from the Middle Ages. Recently, I've been doing a small dive into the Middle Ages, particularly surrounding the idea of the Bubonic Plague, or the Great Death. And upon stumbling on this article that this person has written, I noticed some inadequacies. So this is for prosperity's sake of reporting what we know to be history, and also proclamating that there is a lot of things that we do not know pertaining the medieval era. So this person, right off the bat, starts saying that most people who say that trying to find trans or non-binary people from the Middle Ages, before we had language and all this stuff, is mostly due to gay men and lesbian women, claiming that looking for queer or trans folk in the past is anachronistic. The tacit hope seems to be that gayness or transness are not an inextricable part of humanity or gender diversity. This makes it possible to fantasize about going back in time to when men were men and women were women. That is not the case. That is not the argument that I am making. That is not why I am doing this with this article. I will leave the link to the article in the description below if you would like to read it. That's just not the case, and I'm going to explain why. The first thing that stood out to me about this article that did not make any sense is and let me be very clear, when somebody says medieval pertains to a long period of time. It's actually like 3 or 4 decades is what constitutes what we call the Middle Ages. It's quite a long period of time. It's not, 1 decade. It's more like 100 years is what we call the Middle Ages. The first thing that caught my attention, and they put a date on this, so we roughly know that they're trying to get their statistics post Bubonic Plague, or Great Death, which took place somewhere around the 1340s and ended somewhere around the 1350s or 60s. So I've got an idea of the population because of that right there. And I can tell you just some things just don't make sense. This person says if approximately 0.6% of adults are trans, and I'm not going to include this. For some reason, they're including intersex people in trans and non-binary, where intersex is something entirely different. And I will talk about why that would be really hard to pinpoint as far as the medieval era goes as well. But they talk about 1 out of 2,000 of adults are intersex. So Klinefelters or something of like the other one. There's another one other than Klinefelters. That gives us a figure of about 114,000 trans people and 9,500 intersex people. Okay, right off the bat, there's something very wrong with these statistics, which make me question this person's credibility. And that is, okay, so we know what the population of France was back in 1340. It was 16 million. And we also have to take into account that France was not exactly France back in the Middle Ages. It was kind of broken up by France's cities, actually, much like Italy. Italy was not Italy back in the Middle Ages. It was each city, each major area of, like, you know, Sicilian was actually not a part of Italy back then. It was considered to be a country. France was somewhat similar. So Germany was called the Great Catholic Roman Empire for some reason, but that's what Germany was called in the Middle Ages. So now, okay, so if they are correct on their statistics, okay, so 6%. First of all, it wasn't 19 million people. There weren't 19 million people living in France. There were 16 million people living in France back in the Middle Ages, and specifically the time frame that they have given, which is 1340. And if you break that down mathematically, so 6%, they're saying it was 114 people. Impossible. That math does not make sense. If you do the math yourself, I'll tell you exactly what you end up with. 96,000. 96,000, not 114,000 people were trans. Now, I'm not saying that there were not trans people. I don't want to give that impression at all. I don't want to give the impression that there were, and one of the reasons I don't like the idea of, like, using a term like non-binary, I would prefer to say gender norm conforming, because that's something that's more easily understood. I think maybe non-binary is too ambiguous of a phrase to understand what that means. So certainly they existed back then. Certainly they did. Of course they did. Now, the thing is that back then, it would have been, you would be really hard pressed to find a lot of evidence of trans people and non-binary people, even lesbian and homosexual men. It'd be really difficult to find for one very simple reason. The top, illustrious 10%, okay, so only 10% of the population in the Middle Ages were literate at all. Out of that 10%, 5%, only 5% of that 10% could read and write at the same time. The other 5% could only read. That leaves a whopping 90% of the population completely illiterate, incapable of reading or writing. So the other aspect of this is that back then, they used original English language, which sounds extremely foreign to the English that we speak today. I actually have a recording of Dr. Dorsey Armstrong, who specializes in medieval English literature, and she graduated from Duke University as well as Cambridge University. And also, just for fun fact of Middle Ages, is that they had a feudalist society in the sense that it was based off of bonds of service, support, loyalty, protection, and hierarchy. And how that hierarchical system worked is you had a king. Underneath the king were nobles or vassals or vassalage. Underneath the nobles, there were lords. And at the very bottom were the peasants. So maybe some of your lords that sort of helped operate the cities might have known how, some of them might have known how to read, some of them might have known how to write. but still very few. They would have been part of that 10%. 90% of the population in the medieval times could not read or write. So you'd be very hard-pressed to find any documentation. Most people that got education because they were going to work for the piety or the church. And you couldn't get that education unless you were going to be a part of the piety or the church. So it was both ways. If you had an education, you worked for the church. If you worked for the church, you had an education. That's the medieval era. And the problem that I have with this person's article is that, I mean, there's nothing wrong with reporting history, but we should do it with integrity and honesty. And I get that, you know, people want trans, non-binary, gay and lesbian people. They want these people that they can look at as an example or a hero that they can look up to as representational of that time period. But unfortunately, you're going to be really hard-pressed to find it. The fact of the matter, and this is very interesting too about the medieval days, is that the beginning of the medieval period, they weren't really, I mean, it was considered sinful, homosexuality, that kind of stuff, but you'd be surprised. It wasn't acceptable, but it's not that they cared about it either. It was really interesting. Even during, let's say, the Spanish Inquisition, the only reason you might have a sodomy charge brought up being a homosexual, because they didn't have a word for that. That's not the word they used for it back then. They didn't have homosexual or gay. Those were not words that they used for that. Actually, if you want to know a word that they used for homosexuals or for men specifically, was boogly. This, if you understand that might lead one to think of butt stuff, anal sex. It might get brought up if the church wasn't really interested in if you were doing these things. They were more interested if you challenged the church's authority in deciding that homosexuality and trans and LGBTQI stuff was wrong. If you challenge the church on that, they might bring that up and charge you with it, the fact that you have committed the act. But they were really more interested if you were challenging the church, not so much whether or not you actually were a homosexual or not. They didn't really care about that. They cared about whether or not you were challenging the church's authority. Now, there are examples of pieties and nobles doing court hearings and whatnot where these charges might be brought up, but a lot of pieties or a lot of priests or clergy member back then, they might, I think for men, this is what I find really odd for men, getting caught in homosexuality was only 1 year's penance. For females, for some reason, it was 5 years penance. Don't know why. Don't understand that. So there's several reasons already stacking up that make it really hard to tell what homosexuals, what it was like for homosexuals back in the Middle Ages, or trans or non-binary people in the Middle Ages. We've already got several things stacked against us. For one, 90% of the population was illiterate, meaning they could not read or write. You had a hierarchy system, and really there was kind of this duality between the kings and queens and the church. Both thought that they had divine right to rule. The church was like, I have the right to rule because I'm the church, and the kings and queens thought they had the right to rule because they thought that they had divine purpose of ruling. So the amount of people that would actually interact with anyone that would be LGBTQIA+, was very limited. It would have been limited to the piety, probably, predominantly. There might have been a few kings or lords or nobles that might have interacted, but very few. So the amount of documentation that would have occurred of these people, of that type of person, would be nominal or very low. It wouldn't have been a lot. So we can find a few things here and there suggest, we know that they existed, but we can find a few documentations here and there of homosexual males and females existing, certainly, but we can also find examples of trans or non-binary people. And they wouldn't have been called that back then. They wouldn't have been called trans. Certainly, the terminology non-binary would have been completely mind-blowing to them back in the Middle Ages. They would have no idea what you were talking about. Not a clue. Even if you translated it for them into the English that they used back then, they wouldn't understand what you were talking about. As I found, there were many names for trans and non-binary people. Sometimes they referred to them as eunuchs. As we know, eunuchs is when you cut a male's genitals off, so they maintain that high singing voice that they loved. But another word that I found that was used to describe trans or non-binary people were gallas. And a lot of the times it would seem that they became members of the church. And this would make sense that they would do that they would join the that they would become monks or nuns or priests or priestesses, is that it would give them the ability to maintain that gender anonymity by doing so. So some of the piety might have encountered some of these people that had, non-mainstream gender conforming roles, and they would have encountered them, and they would have created different names. That's why there's so many different words describing what we call trans and non-binary people today. And the accounts of that is really small. It's very, very minuscule, because as we're all well aware of, and we have to be intellectually honest here, being that the church basically was the law of the land in the Middle Ages, they did not look particularly fond on people who were LGBTQIA+. So the documents that would have been written about them would have been really, you might have some mentions here and there, but keep in mind, only 5% of the population could read and write. The top 10% were literate, so only 5% could read. So a whopping 90% were completely illiterate. They could not read, they could not write. Also, you have the barrier of language, which the English language has changed dramatically. I will now pause this, stop it here, and play you a clip of Dr. Dorsey Armstrong reading Piers Plowman in Old English, so you can hear what the original English language sounded like.
Passus of this famous dream poem, Piers says, Ik shall swinka and sweta and soa for us botha, and labora for they while thou livest all the lief time, in covenant that thou keep holy church and myselva, for wasters and wicked men that thus world striven and go hunt harde lecha to haras and to foxes, to boras and to bacchus, that breaketh adown many hedges, and fight by falconers, to call wield foolas, for they common to me croft, me corn to de foola. End quote.
All right, pretty cool, huh? Very interesting. So the other thing is that the numbers don't make sense in this article. So I can tell you this. In the Middle Ages, post Bubonic Plague, there was a population spike where the world's human population in the Middle Ages was 500 million people. After the plague ran through the lands, it took out 200 to 300 million people. So that's a good portion of the entirety of the world's population. It went from 500 million, they lost 200 million. So that only leaves 300 million after the plague, and it took several decades for the human population to recover back to 500 million after they lost that. So, it wasn't until, just for fun fact, it wasn't until King Louis III where they actually started inciting the death penalty for homosexual behavior. And how it went was, this was King Louis III's idea. It was first time offense was castration. Second offense was dismemberment. Third offense was death by fire. So the main focal point of the hierarchy back then was very, very against it. They weren't. It wouldn't have been something that would have been, if you talked about it openly, you'd be doing it at a very high risk. So I'm not saying they didn't exist. I'm saying that finding documentation of their existence would have been extraordinarily, mind-blowingly difficult. And I will circle back around to that in a moment. So you have very little accountants of this. Now, some people have turned to, and I'll show you this image of Saint Sebastian. People are saying that he was a homosexual. I don't know where they're getting this from. Maybe there's something I haven't read. But my understanding about Saint Sebastian is this, is first of all, he was not from the Middle Ages. He was from the Roman Empire. And he was put as a saint because he would pray. They had a plague of a sort back in post-Middle Ages that ran through the Greek and the Roman Empire. It was not the bubonic plague. It was a different one. But he would pray for all these sick people and they would become healed. Oftentimes, St. Sebastian is depicted as this man that is being put on a post with a whole bunch of arrows driven through him. So he was considered saintly because, for one, he would pray for a bunch of people who were sick and they would magically get better. But the big point of it is that he was crucified because he announced himself to be Christian. And the Roman Empire basically said, if you do not renounce your Christian faith, then we will crucify you. And he would not renounce his faith as a Christian, and thus was crucified. There hasn't been a lot of I haven't seen any other suggestions that would say that he was homosexual. However, there was one article I read where they said that many homosexual Christians prayed to Saint Sebastian because he is associated with plagues or, a mass amount of illnesses. So when you're talking about like HIV, one might pray to Saint Sebastian. But there's nothing really suggesting that he was a homosexual. So, and of course we know homosexuals existed back then. There are accounts of that. There are accounts of people who don't fit the gender norms. So what we would call trans or non-binary today. Now, the intersex question is interesting because they would not have the ability to really diagnose intersex back then. You might have the hermaphrodism aspect where somebody is born with ambiguous genitals, bearing resemblance of both male and female. And that's probably what they would have called it back then, is hermaphrodism or being hermaphrodite, even though it's not true hermaphrodite in the biological sense of maintaining both male and female, fully functioning male and female reproductive organs. The other one is the one that would be most curious is the Klinefelters, where you would see the genitals of a male, but they did not have x-rays or the medical technology or availability to look inside that person to say, oh my goodness, they have outside, they might even have a micro penis, but they have a penis and testicles, but internally they have ovaries and the biological makeup of a female that are fully functioning, where the male exterior is not functioning. They wouldn't have had that medical savvy back then to do that. You're talking about an era where they thought that human feces rolled up with herbs was a way to treat wounds. As you can guess, that's a horrible way to treat wounds. We do not treat wounds by putting human feces with herbs in it. That's a good way to get septicemia. Some of the other aspects of medicine back then were extremely bizarre and would not make sense today. There was a certain sort of logic behind it, but it's not something that we would call logical or practical today. A lot of it had to do with your astrology, your astrological sign, if you were fire, water, wind. They considered yellow bile as to be like water. They considered black bile or solid bile to be earth. Fire, I believe, was blood. And I don't remember how all of it worked exactly, but based on your element, two people could be treated very differently for the exact same thing because your treatment was based on your element. Bloodletting was almost always the go-to, even though that was predominantly you would think would be reserved for the fire element, as that was allocated to blood. But bloodletting was almost the go-to treatment for almost anything back then. So I don't see Klinefelters as being something that they would have been highly aware of. It's just they did not have a lot of medical ingenuity back then. Just really far removed from what we have as far as medical science goes today. Just they probably wouldn't have had any clue, to be honest. They might have seen it in cadavers, like opening people up and going, oh my gosh, they have ovaries, if they even knew that much about human anatomy back then. So that's another hiccup in this whole idea of trans people everywhere, blah, 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 blah. Even Joan of Arc, she really broke the gender norms, but Joan of Arc didn't necessarily describe herself as a man. She dressed up as a man because she thought she was commanded by God to do so she could fight in the name of God for France at the time. So, I mean, we have examples of people breaking gender norms. As I said, though, someone like Joan of Arc, even though she dressed up as a man, she still very much identified as a female. The only reason she dressed up like a man was so that she could join the military, because God told her to fight in the war for France. Thus, Joan of Arc was, made Joan of Arc. But again, like I said, she did not identify as a man. She is not what we would call now trans, or non-binary for that matter. She had an actual reason for doing that, not what we think of. Some people have made I don't know if it's a conspiracy, if you would call it a conspiracy, but some people think or have this idea that Queen Elizabeth I was actually a man, even though Queen Elizabeth I does not fall into the medieval period category, and nor do I think Joan of Arc does. I don't know that she falls into the medieval category. Of course they existed. Of course they did. But to say that there's all this evidence for them is just intellectually dishonest. To say that they were widely recognized in the society is just dishonest. Like the Middle Ages would have been a dark time to live in for anyone because of bubonic plague, because it hit twice. It hit multiple times. Actually, it hit more than twice. It hit multiple times. It wasn't until the 19th was it the 19th century or the 20th century that they actually discovered what was causing it. It was a long ways away from antibiotics. But I think it wasn't until the 1900s I think it was the 19th century, they finally discovered the bacteria that was causing what was known as bubonic plague. And there might have actually, during the bubonic plague or the Great Death, they didn't call it the bubonic plague in the medieval era, they called it the Great Death. There was probably several diseases going around that were contributing to it, because some of the symptoms that are described in some aspects do not describe the bacteria that causes bupos, or the purplish welts that would show up on people's bodies. That was caused by the bacteria. Some people reported other things that are more indicative of other diseases that we know of today. So I'm not saying that they didn't exist. Of course they did. Of course there are people that were born male or female that identified as the opposite. Of course there were people that broke gender norm stereotypes, that were ambiguous in gender. They existed. But finding documentation of that is going to be extremely difficult. And here's what I'm circling back around to, is that what we know of the Middle Ages is thanks to the piety and the members of the church and the people who became educated, that 10% that could read and write, which really is only 5% that could both read and write. And then the other 5% that could read. So all we know about the Middle Ages comes from that 10%. But the really sad part is there's, for everything that we do know about the Middle Ages, there's way more, like an extravagant amount of things we do not know about the Middle Ages because 90% of the population could not read, let alone write. So the peasants, the everyday people back then, their accounts, the way that they lived their lives and their perspective are not documented because they did not know how to read or write. And their perspective is lost because of that. So the small amounts of, like, you know, this homosexual man or woman being put on trial and their acts of sodomy might get brought up, that's a document that, you know, comes to document that, yes, it existed. Or, you know, the people working in the churches that come across these priests or, not priests, but like, maybe a friar or something like that. The people who worked for the church that came from the peasants or maybe sometimes nobility would go, you know, swear an act of silence and all that, go and work for the church. So some of the piety might have ran into them, and so therefore we get some documentation of trans or non-binary people who would live their life as the opposite or a different gender, and they could hide because, you know, nobody's going to question that. It would be a great way to hide, but very, very little documentation of it because the church was the law of the land back then, and they did not look highly upon that. And you got to remember, the people who were capable of reading and writing were already a part of the church in the first place. So the amount of what's the word I'm looking for? Documentation that would have taken place would have been very slim. It is there, but it's a very small number. So I just want to reiterate that. I'm not saying they didn't exist. I'm saying you're talking about a time when 90%, the majority of the population, could not leave anything behind to tell you that they were homosexual, or that they were lesbian, or that they didn't feel like that they were a woman even though they were born as one, or they didn't feel like they were a man even though they were born as one. They wouldn't have been able to write it down, let alone read it. It's just not something, you'd be hard-pressed to find it. You'd be really hard-pressed to find it. And really just a small number of documentations of it even exist. Like I said, I was able to dig up, you know, galas or eunuchs. They called them by so many names because it just wasn't something that was widely known. And I mean, even the name for homosexual men and females back then, it wouldn't have been that. It would have been something completely different back then. It would have been called something else. So this is why when I read this article right off the bat, they're just like, they say in the article that in France, in the Low Countries, that they're saying that 114,000 trans people existed and 9,500 intersex people existed out of a population of 19 million. First of all, it wasn't 19 million, it was 18 million. And if no, their 0.6% is accurate, then the number wouldn't be 114,000. It would only have been 96,000. And I remember the world population back then was 500 million, and 200 to 300 million of that were wiped out by the Bubonic Plague. And it took them several decades to recover the population back up to 500 million. So I'm not trying to piss on your party to anyone that's trans or non-binary. I just want you to realize that being trans or non-binary in the Middle Ages would have been a rough time. Being a lesbian or homosexual male in the Middle Ages would have been a rough time. It wouldn't have been easy to do. Like I said, the word that I found for homosexual men in the Middle Ages was the word boogly. This has to do with the reference of an ultimate act of sodomy. So, butt sex. But, I mean, if anything, that's proof that they participated in anal sex back then. So, and that's even listed as an act of sodomy. So, I mean, they wouldn't have a rule against it if people weren't doing it. So, we know it existed because there were laws against it. And you also have to remember that they lived in a feudalist society. And like I said, as the hierarchy goes, it goes king, nobles, or vassals. And then underneath the nobles, it was the lords. And at the very bottom, which is the majority of the population, was the peasants. And the overall mindset of the people in the Middle Ages is that this system of hierarchy was the best. People did not aspire, people who are peasants did not aspire to become lords or nobles, because they perceived every position in that hierarchical system to be just as equivalently important. And that's just the mindset that they had in the Middle Ages. That's what we find. And that's not saying that it's right. I'm not saying that it's wrong. That's just the way it was. And to impose your own agenda and look for things in history that didn't exist just because you want them to is not helpful. When reporting about the history, you should report exactly, precisely what you find and not exude your own biases into it. Because then you're just being intellectually dishonest at that point. And the honest truth is that the Middle Ages were a rough time for anyone, but they probably would have been particularly rough for anyone that we dib today using current language, LGBTQIA+. Would have been very, very difficult for them back then. And not a lot of records of existing. But there are some. We can find some. That's being intellectually honest, saying there are some, but very, very, very few, because 90% of the population could not read or write. And the only people that could were members of the church. So, I understand that we all want heroes to look up to. We want, anybody that's LGBTQIA+, they want to see representation of people like that back in the Middle Ages. I get that. But let's be intellectually honest here. There wasn't a lot. There just wasn't a lot of representation of people who were lesbian, homosexual males, people who were trans, or people who did not fit gender norms. Just wasn't a lot. And see, even the person who wrote this article lists Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc did not identify as a man. She, like I said, she dressed up as a man so she could join the military. There's nothing in any of the texts that you will read that would all be written in a language you wouldn't recognize. You would have to get a scholar to actually translate it. But there's nothing in it that suggests that Joan of Arc was dressing up as a man because she identified as one. Maybe you could call her non-binary, but the reason for her doing it was because she was commanded by God to join the war because France was supposed to win. But she identified as a woman. So this is just them interjecting their own biases on what we already know and understand to be history. And I don't know why. I mean, I know why you would do that, but it's not intellectually honest. It's not. And I find that interesting because that's one of the things, this is off the subject matter of the medieval period. It's one of the things in one of Blaire White's videos that she brought up about the trans community versus the gay rights movement, is that the gay rights movement got its freedom because gay men and women were intellectually honest in the public discourse when we were talking, like saying, yes, we know we're different, but we would still like to be active members of society, blah, 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 blah. And then you have trans activists today that are basically like, like you can't even talk about detransitioning. You can't talk about just even the concept that somebody who transitions is still a biological, like somebody who's born a male that transitions into a female, that's still a biological woman. That's just biologically inaccurate as hell. And I don't know what to say about the non-binary thing. You've got people that are detracting their statement saying, no, it's legit. And it's like, well, what do you mean that there's more than two genders? I think you can identify as a gender that doesn't exist. Absolutely. You can believe whatever you want. But when we're looking at physical, tangible evidence, I don't know where you get that. And that's that's honestly where the narrative is being lost, is that, these people are not being intellectually honest, like the person who wrote this article. And I think their intentions are good. And I'm not trying to just be like, oh my gosh, a trans person wrote about trans people in the Middle Ages, therefore they just must be wrong. No. I'm saying I've read the article and it doesn't make sense based off of what the little tiny bit that we do know. It's a very small amount of things that we know about the Middle Ages. Very small amount of things that we know. A lot of information about the Middle Ages has been forever lost because 90% of the population could not read or write. And that's just the truth. And the church was the law of the land. That's just the truth. It's not good, but that's the way it was. You don't have to like it. We've come a long way and things are different now. Be happy with that we don't live in Middle Age time. And that's about all I have to say on that. And this is not to trans bash. It's not to bash non-binaries. I'm just saying this article doesn't make sense. And I know we like to avoid uncomfortable truths, but it doesn't help your cause to do that. It's just intellectually dishonest. All right. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Like, share, subscribe, hit the bell button on any channel you're subscribed to. And with that, I'm out.